This is Jim Hughes with AFIO Now. We are a program of recorded interviews with former U.S. intelligence officers and those who write about them. Today, I have a very interesting guest. He's been with us before. His name is Steve Vogel. Steve is a former journalist with the Washington Post for over 2 decades. He covered the fall of the Berlin Wall, the first Gulf War, military operations in Somalia, Rwanda, the Balkans, and Iraq. The stories that he helped to write for the Washington Post for the Afghan War figured in their publication that was a candidate for the finalists for the Pulitzer Prize in 2002. And he also covered the 9/11 attacks on the Pentagon. But most relevant for today, he's the author of a fascinating book called Betrayal in Berlin. We had Steve on last November, and he told us the story of the Berlin Tunnel, which, if you haven't seen it, it's just an amazing story. But that was only half of the story. And so I'm delighted to tell you that Steve is back today to tell us the other half about the infamous British spy, George Blake. Steve, welcome back to AFIO Now.
Thank you for having me again, Jim. I enjoyed it.
Okay. Well, over to you. Go ahead and tell us about George Blake.
Sure. Yeah. We didn't get to talk about him as much as we would have liked last time, just because of his, well, of course, the tunnel is kind of an epic tale itself, but George Blake had a very epic life. And in fact, as I'm sure most of the viewers know, he only died about a year ago at age 98. And I was able to talk to him for my research, and we can go into that later. But I wanted to start with just going over a bit of his background, where George Blake came from, because I think it's important for understanding what would happen eventually. And that story begins back at the end of World War I. Let me share some PowerPoint slides that I have for the occasion. He was born in 1922 as George Behar. His father was actually a Sephardic Jew from Constantinople originally, who had ended up fighting for the British Army during World War I. And at the end of the war, he was stationed in Holland, helping to demobilize the British Army. And George, or Albert Behar, the father, met a Dutch woman, and they married. She was a Dutch Protestant, and their first child was George, born in 1922. And Albert actually named him after King George of England. He was a diehard British patriot, and as it happens, George was born on November 11th, which was Armistice Day. So in a fit of patriotism, he named his son after the king. And young George was raised near the town of Rotterdam. His father owned a leather factory where he made gloves for the workmen who worked at the ports of Rotterdam and other Dutch ports. His father, though, died when George was pretty young, at age 13. Apparently, he had been exposed to mustard gas during World War I, and he had lung problems and died of lung cancer. And George's mother was not particularly well-to-do, and they were left with a lot of debts. But before dying, the father had recommended that she send George to go live with his relatives in Egypt. His sister was married to a very wealthy family in Cairo, and they could see to his schooling. So at age 13, young George was put on a cargo ship and sailed by himself to Cairo. And he essentially, I think I said before that he lives this early life that's part, 1001 Arabian Nights, part Grimm's fairy tale, part Great Escape. But at this point, he goes to live with the Curiel family, and they live on an island in the Nile. They in a huge Italian-style palazzo with 17 rooms and Nubian servants in white robes with red sashes serving meals. And just a gorgeous setting. And he's sent to a French school in Cairo and later an English school. Goes back to Holland on the summers to visit with relatives, but is there in Egypt for 3 years. And the family, the Curiel family, was quite interesting. One of the cousins, who was of college age at the time, sort of took George under his wing, and he used to take him to the real slums of Cairo and the outskirts of Cairo, where the young boy was exposed to some of the haves and have-nots. Here he is living in a very wealthy setting, and he sees these scenes of poverty that were for him pretty shocking. And there could have been some influence going on here with Henri, because Henri was studying at the time at Cairo University, and he would later found the Egyptian Communist Party. So while young George at this point considers himself a very religious boy, and he's certainly not a communist, he did have some interesting influences at that age. He's sent back to Holland as World War II is just starting, and the relatives in Holland didn't want to send him back to Egypt at that time. There's concern about U-boats sinking ships. So George is back in Holland just in time for the Nazis to invade Holland in May of 1940. And he's in Rotterdam with his grandmother when the dive bombers are attacking Rotterdam and turn the city into this blazing inferno. And they're hiding underneath the kitchen table with pots on their heads. And when he emerges, Rotterdam is completely in flames. And this was pretty traumatic event, obviously, for all concerned. And in the chaos of the days that followed, because the Behar family holds British passports, they are suddenly evacuated from Holland. The British embassy is able to get a number of its citizens out, but on the day that evacuation occurs, George is off in the country visiting relatives. So his mother, when he gets back to his home, his mother and his sister have abruptly left, and they are hoping that George is on one of these ships, but he's not. And by the time he learns what's happened, he's basically there on his own with various uncles and aunts, and they hide him out in the countryside for a while because he's subject to arrest. But it's not too long before the local authorities, who are now working for the Nazis, come knocking on the door, and he's sent to an internment camp that's run by the SS for several months. But because he's so young at this point, I think he's at this point 17 years old. He is actually released because they decide that they're not going to hold anyone younger than 18. But he kind of figures he's living on borrowed time. And it's not too long before he begins working for volunteering for the Dutch resistance. He, even though he's at this point 17, he looks much younger than that. And he spends, he's taken on as a courier, and he spends a lot of time bicycling around Holland, delivering packages, messages, flyers, that sort of thing. And he has a couple of close calls with the Nazis, but he gets by because of how young he looks. But as his 18th birthday approaches, he figures that he's really exposed. He's really, because he's also half Jewish, half British, he figures he has every reason to maybe try to escape and get to England. So he approaches some resistance figures in the Netherlands, and they in turn slip him across the border into occupied France, and where the French resistance helps him over the course of several weeks to work his way down to so-called to free France outside of the Vichy run portion of France during World War II. And then he tries to make it across the Spanish border. And just at this time, the Allied invasion of North Africa takes place. And Hitler, at this point, decides he's going to seize all of France. George has to escape across the Pyrenees to get into Spain. with the help of some guides. And once he makes it to Spain, as soon as he's across the border, he's detained by soldiers of Franco's government. Franco, of course, he's neutral, but he's an ally or friendly at least to Hitler. So George, along with a number of other detainees from different countries who've made their way to Spain, are held in one of Franco's prisons for several months. And finally, the British government is able to negotiate the release of a number of their citizens. And George sails to Scotland, where he soon is reunited with his mother and sister. His mother is working as a housekeeper. She, incidentally, has recently changed her name from Behar to Blake. She wants to adopt a more Anglo-sounding name. So he's now a George Blake. And it's not too long before he gets bored. He's had a pretty active couple of years there, and being in London and not being involved in the fight, so to speak, he finds a bit dull. So he's not before too long. He volunteers. He signs up for the Royal Navy, and initially he's being trained as a diver, and this is something he's not well suited for at all. He passes out on his training dives. And fortunately for him, anyway, he had a commander who recognizes that this young man speaks several languages, and he has some potential as a intelligence officer. So, unbeknownst to George, he is recommended to the Secret Intelligence Service, and they interview him, and he doesn't even realize he's being considered for this position. But after a couple of weeks, they take him on as an officer in the SIS. So he's because he speaks fluent Dutch, he's assigned to the Dutch section and helps the agents who are being sent to Holland to spy on Nazi positions. This is around the time of Operation Market Garden and after D-Day, when the Allied armies are moving into the Netherlands, and he helps prepare agents who are being parachuted in to Holland so they can radio back positions. Of course, within a year of that, the Nazi government collapses, Hitler is dead, and Blake is sent to the Netherlands to deal with some of the aftermath. Most people who have been recruited into SIS during the war years kind of return to their civilian lives, but Blake found he kind of had a taste for it. So he applies to stay on, and he is. They agree to keep him on. He's sent to occupy Germany, where ostensibly he's supposed to keep his eye on prisoners from U-boat captains who were still being kept in a camp, to make sure there were no Nazi sympathizers among them who were trying to, restore the Nazi rule. But his real task was to recruit among these U-boat captains to find Germans who might be willing to spy on the Soviet presence that has established itself in Eastern Germany as part of the Allied Four Powers Agreement dividing Germany. So he soon has a couple of networks of German spies operating in Soviet-occupied Eastern Germany, and he does a good job at this. And he's soon taken on as a permanent hire by SIS. He's sent to Cambridge to study Russian, because he already speaks about 4 languages, but they want him to focus on the Soviets. So he learns Russian at Cambridge. He's also has time to read up on Marxism, and he kind of finds a certain appeal to what he's reading by his later account. Up to this point, he's been a very religious young man, brought up as a Dutch Protestant. But while he's at Cambridge, he kind of has a falling out with religion. He spends times in some of the cathedrals there thinking about this. And by the time he leaves Cambridge, he's decided he's no longer a Christian. Therefore, by his account, he has kind of a vacuum in his mind. So around this time, he's hoping to go to the Middle East because he has a fascination having grown up in Egypt. But instead, to his disappointment, he's sent to South Korea in 1949, where he's the chief of station of a very small office that the British have just set up in the recently divided Korean Peninsula. And he's given the task of trying to recruit basically from Vladivostok, the Russian seaport that's near North Korea, and he finds this a very difficult job and has no success. And he's given a stern review by one of the SIS officers in that region, who happens to be very down on foreigners. And Blake at this time begins to feel a certain resentment that because of his foreign upbringing, he's not being considered a fully British by some of his colleagues. And this too, I think, plays in what will eventually happen. So Korea, though, turns out to be not quite the dull place he's thinking it's going to be, because, of course, in 1950, North Korea invades and takes over the South, and Great Britain begins, instead of staying a neutral, sides with the U.S. And so the British delegation in Seoul is taken prisoner, and Blake, along with the rest of the diplomats and French diplomats as well, are brought up to a prison camp in northern North Korea, and they undergo this horrendous death march. This is in the fall and late fall of 1950, and the Siberian winter kicks in as they're marching on foot along with a number of American GIs who've been captured to prison camps that are further away from the fighting. And this is around the time that MacArthur is moving across the 38th parallel into North Korea, and so the prisoners are being moved further back to stay away from that fighting. But there's wild back and forth in that war. Blake tries to escape a couple of times, but he's recaptured. And then things settle down after the Chinese intervention. And Blake has a lot of free time along with the other prisoners. Conditions improve for them somewhat. At some point during the 3 years he's held as a captive, the picture on the left there showing him as a captive, he, in discussions with the head of the British delegation, who had also had some Marxist, not sympathies, but he felt that the British Empire was on its last gasps essentially, and he thought that that communism was going to be the wave of the future. And Blake's a pretty impressionable guy. He seems to kind of absorb a lot of what he hears from the people around him, and he views the heavy Allied bombing of North Korea that's going on around him rather negatively. And at some point during this captivity, according to Blake's account, he makes the decision that he's fighting on the wrong side, and he slips a note one evening to the North Korean guards and asks if he can meet with Soviet officials. And some weeks later, a group of Soviets come to the town of Manpo, where Blake and the rest of the diplomatic captives are being held. And these Russians talk to all the prisoners one by one, but the one they're most interested in is Blake. And during one of these meetings, Blake makes the offer to spy for the KGB. Now, whether it happened the way that Blake outlines it, in that this was something he initiated, or whether it was something that the KGB, who is monitoring these camps, perhaps they saw him as someone who might be susceptible to recruitment. Either way it happened, the end result is they recruit someone who turns out to be a very committed ideological communist, and they then bide their time. Blake is held for another 2 years after this meeting, before the war approaches an end, and British captives are sent back, and Blake goes back to hero's welcome back to England. And he's held in very high regard. His fellow captives say that he was one of the folks that kept them together, led by example. And SIS gives him a very cursory vetting. They have him over for tea, and cluck their tongues about how tough the conditions were in Korea, and then they basically say, well, good job, and here's your next assignment. And George Blake, then in the summer of 1953, is given an assignment to a new section of SIS that's been established. It's called Section Y. And this is an office that's been created to exploit what's becoming a new and important source of information, which is basically electronic intercepts. And there's kind of a feeling in the intelligence world at this point that electronic intercepts are going to be the real wave of the future. There's not going to be as much need for human intelligence. And Blake, as he would go on to show, believes that while electronic intercepts were important, there was always going to be a need for the human, the man in the room, so to speak. And nonetheless, Blake is made the deputy of this new section. They need a Russian speaker, and they are actually getting quite a bit of information, primarily at that point from some tunnels that had been dug in Vienna, which is a divided city. And SIS, Peter Lund there on the left, had been SIS man in Vienna, and he'd come up with this idea for digging tunnels in Vienna, small tunnels, to tap into Red Army communication lines that went from the Soviet sector into the Western sector. And this turns out to be quite successful. And Peter Lund and also Bill Harvey, who is sent in 1952 to be the chief of the CIA's base in Berlin, both have designs on doing the same thing on a much larger scale in Berlin. And Section Y in London is basically the office that is overseeing this. So they soon come up with this idea of targeting cables down in the very southern tip of Berlin between the American sector and the Soviet sector. And they come up with a place where they think they can reach, based on intelligence they've gathered from the East German telecommunications ministry, these cables that run underneath one of the East German highways. And this operation is just a concept in 1953 when Blake is being sent to Section Y. And he doesn't learn about the Berlin project initially, but he does learn about the Vienna operation because he's there going through these reports. There's a Soviet that he's working with in London by the name of Sergei Kondrashov, who's been sent to London to be specifically Blake's handler. He was ostensibly the cultural attaché for the Soviet embassy in London, but his real job was to handle Blake. He was kind of a jovial guy. He too spoke many languages. He'd worked in some counterintelligence roles in Moscow, but he was unknown to British intelligence, and they had great hopes and designs for Blake. So they didn't want to have someone who was known to MI5 as a KGB guy. And so Kondrashov, who's normally dealing with the ballet troops that are coming to London, or the chess delegations, getting tickets for sporting events for visitors, that sort of thing. He's also meeting with Blake, usually near one of the tube underground stations late at night. And Blake is able to pass on information about this Vienna operation to Kondrashov. And it's very, very interesting stuff. The Soviets had no idea about this tunnel operation. And so Blake is proving his worth early on. And it's not too long after that Blake learns about this Berlin operation, which he learns about it during a meeting in late December 1953. This is actually before even a single spadeful of soil had been dug for the tunnel. But he is called into this meeting between the CIA and SIS to plan some of the details of the tunnel. And needless to say, he's the guy taking the notes, and he finds this pretty interesting. So in January of 1954, he meets with Kondrashov on a double-decker bus in London and hands him a carbon copy of the notes he's taken at this meeting, and gives him a quick rundown on what is being planned. And Kondrashov is, he just feels like this incredible sensation of urgency when he hears this, and he feels that the carbon copy he's carrying in his pocket now is burning a hole in his chest. And this information, of course, is sent on to Moscow and to Moscow Center. But the decision is made pretty early on that nothing is going to be done by the KGB to interfere with this tunnel. The idea being that Blake is already proving himself so valuable that if they if they do anything to stop this tunnel, Blake is going to be one of the very few people that know anything about it. So it's allowed to proceed for almost a year. It's completed in May of 55, and the Soviets manufacture a discovery of it in April of 56. But as I noted in our previous discussion about the tunnel, because the KGB didn't do anything to stop the tunnel, they also didn't plant any disinformation, because that would have fingered Blake in a heartbeat, because of the vast amount of actual information that was being recorded by the British and Americans. The CIA and SIS get quite a bit out of the tunnel for over a year. Once the tunnel is discovered in April of 56, Blake has to lay quite low. He's been given a advance warning that this is going to happen. So he kind of, I should have mentioned earlier that Blake was actually transferred to Berlin in May of 1955, just as the Berlin tunnel was getting operational. And ironically, because he's now in Berlin, he actually knows less about the tunnel than he did when he was back in London, because now he doesn't have a need to know about the tunnel. So he's working for Peter Lunn, who's the station chief in Berlin. And Lunn loves Blake because he seems to be a real go-getter. And he very effectively is able to recruit a Soviet official who has a lot of access to Soviet economic detail, and works in Moscow, but is often visiting Berlin. And Peter Lunn is just very impressed with Blake's work, not knowing though that the KGB had basically set this whole thing up. They'd given Blake a Soviet official he could recruit, and therefore increase his standing with his Peter Lunn and the folks back in London. And Blake accordingly is viewed as one of the best operators that Peter Lunn has. So he's been effective for some while the tunnel is operational. Once the tunnel ends, he lays low, but then he resumes his espionage once it's clear that the Americans and the British don't suspect him as having any role in the discovery of this tunnel. So he in effect becomes a one-man tunnel. He operates in Berlin for another 3 years, and according to some of the Stasi and KGB documents that were later produced, Blake effectively rolls up several agent networks that that the British had operating in East Germany. He gives the KGB a complete rundown of how the SIS station in Berlin works, all the personnel, the officers. He also betrays hundreds of agents who are working for the British. These are primarily East Germans in the different ministries or jobs, mostly low level, but all people that are providing information to the British about the Soviets and what they're up to in Eastern Europe. So he does an enormous damage to British intelligence for years. But over this same time period, he started a family. His wife, Gillian, who had also been an SIS secretary in London, had come with him to London. They'd had 2 children, and Blake by now is starting to have some second thoughts about this espionage work, because he's kind of loving family life. He's been doing this now for really since 1953, and by 1959, he's eager to get out of Berlin and see if he can get out of espionage altogether, because he feels some pressures, and his wife doesn't have any idea about what he's doing. And finally, in 59, they're sent back to England, and Blake is very excited because he's going to be given an assignment to study Arabic in Lebanon, and he views this as a potential way to get out of espionage. They want him. The British at this point, this is post Suez crisis, have come to the realization that they need better intelligence operation in the Middle East, and they see Blake as someone who can help them do that. And but Blake's idea is to use the Arabic and somehow try to find a job in the private sector. He's even thinking about working for the oil company. So he manages to put his Marxist love of Marxism on hold for a bit as he dreams up these job opportunities. But they arrive in Lebanon in 1960, September of 60, and then he's doing quite well in his course in early 1961. But unbeknownst to him, there are now some red flags that are being raised about Blake and his work. And this comes from a Polish military intelligence officer who begins passing on information to the CIA that points to a Soviet penetration of British intelligence. And at first, Blake they do a cursory review and they consider Blake above suspicion. So they decide it can't be Blake. And he goes on, and eventually the British decide that maybe the Soviets had managed to break into a safe that gave them access to some of the NATO secrets that George Blake would have had access to. But the Polish agent who defects, Golanewski, eventually provides more evidence that points to Blake being the source of these documents. And in April of 1961, he's lured back to London by SIS, on the pretense that he needs to discuss his next assignment. Blake is kind of suspicious about this because he's in the middle of his course studying Arabic. He's doing quite well, and he doesn't understand why they can't wait till the end of the semester to do this. But he checks with the KGB, and the KGB, his handler in Beirut gives him the clearance to go. They don't think there's any danger. And once he gets back to London, he finds himself being interrogated by Harry Shergold, who was the investigator who kind of put together the evidence that Blake was a spy. For 3 days, Blake denies everything, and they don't really have any hard evidence against him. It's all circumstantial, and Blake is thinking he can probably get away, and that's what Shergold thinks too. But then Shergold tries this new tack, and he says, "Well, we know, George, why you spied for the Soviets. It's because they tortured you, and now they're blackmailing you. They forced you to do this." And Blake has this ego of being someone who's above nationality and someone who's spying only for ideological reasons, and this offends him. And so he just blurts out and he goes, "No, I'm doing this voluntarily." He just spills out the whole thing, and for the next hours and hours, he basically confesses everything he's been doing for the last decade, which is a lot. There's a lot of damage to go over. This includes, of course, the Berlin Tunnel, also a number of other operations. And SIS is just, of course, in turmoil about this. And the CIA and Bill Harvey, of course, aren't too happy when they hear about it. And Harold Macmillan, the British Prime Minister, has to break the news to JFK that the Berlin Tunnel and a number of other operations were compromised. Also, this memo, which I found in the Kennedy library, only fairly recently declassified, was prepared by Allen Dulles to give to President Kennedy. And Dulles asked that he asked the president's officer or military officer to destroy the documents after Kennedy had read it. Fortunately, they didn't. At least from my perspective, I was glad they didn't destroy it. But it talks about Blake betraying the tunnel, but it also hints that it doesn't name it, but it hints that Pyotr Popov, who was the GRU officer who was giving, who'd been an enormously important source to the CIA in Berlin and later also in Vienna, and then but primarily in Berlin and in Eastern Germany in general, that he was actually a spy for the Americans. And because Popov is arrested, and it could have been because of some information that Blake passed on to the KGB. Also, Penkovsky, who at this point is only now beginning his espionage work for the Americans in April of 1961 when Blake is arrested. Blake had given the Soviets information that Rory Chisholm, an officer for the SIS in Berlin, was working for SIS. So when Chisholm is sent to Moscow, and his wife works as a handler with Penkovsky. They are both under surveillance, and that soon puts Penkovsky under the radar of the Soviets, and he is arrested in October of 1961, just as the Cuban Missile Crisis is underway. And of course, the information that he had provided concerning Soviet missiles was very critical, probably in avoiding a nuclear war. But it's quite possible that both of these valuable spies were betrayed, at least in part, based on information that Blake passed along. Blake is given a 42-year sentence, which was the longest sentence passed down by a British court in modern court history, previous 150 years. He's assigned to Wormwood Scrubs, which is a Victorian-era prison in Western London, which, as it turns out, doesn't have the greatest security in the world. You know, Blake, obviously, the damage he's done is caused quite a bit of a stir. For the British, one perspective why the CIA didn't get more angry about it was that the Cuban Missile Crisis and also the Bay of Pigs invasion, which follows in 1962, breaks. So the Americans are sort of distracted on some of the fires on their own front. But in any event, Blake manages over the years that he's at Wormwood Scrubs to make a lot of friends. It's kind of to his surprise too, but a lot of his fellow prisoners felt that he'd been given an overly harsh sentence. This was, by British standards, quite unbelievable, 42-year sentence. And he has Blake's personality is very ingratiating. He makes a lot of friends in prison. He helps, a lot of them write their letters to their attorneys. He teaches some prisoners French. He teaches others Arabic. He's kind of like the comforting shoulder that a lot of the younger prisoners rest their head on. So he's a very popular guy. And over a period of 5 or 6 years, Blake comes to realize that the KGB is not going to try to spring him. They're not going to do a spy trade for him because Blake has already, confessed to everything. So they don't really the Soviets don't really have a reason to trade him for someone like Gary Francis Powers. They trade for Rudolph Abel instead because Abel hasn't confessed. So Blake decides he's going to have to work his own way out of prison. And one of the fellow prisoners he recruits is an Irishman named Sean Burke, who is very anti-authoritarian, a bit of a poet, drunk type of guy. And Burke takes up this job very happily. He's released from prison in 1965, and he immediately goes to work trying to free Blake. And they've come up with this plan where Burke, with the help of some other prisoners who have since been released, will raise some money, and they're going to get a hideaway apartment near Wormwood Scrubs and a getaway car, and they're going to have they managed to smuggle a walkie-talkie into the prison that Blake is able to use so he can communicate with Burke. Burke would sit outside the prison walls. There was a hospital, Hammersmith Hospital was right next door, so he'd pose as a visitor getting ready to go in to bring flowers to a relative. And the whole escape scheme revolves around this idea of throwing a rope ladder over the east wall of the prison, which is near the hospital, and Blake managing to scramble over the wall into the waiting getaway car. And unbelievably enough, I mean, this is a pretty amateur operation, but Wormwood Scrubs did not have great security, and that's the wall they want to cross over. And this is the ladder that Burke and several other of his conspirators build. They use knitting needles as the legs of those rope ladders, so it can give some support. October 1966, they wait for a Saturday night when most of the prisoners go off to another hall to watch a movie, and it's kind of a quiet time at the prison, and it's a dark, rainy night, and Burke is going to park outside the prison wall and throw over the rope ladder. Now, all kinds of things go wrong. Burke gets caught in traffic, and he's late getting there. And Blake manages to slip out one of the windows that a accomplice had broken a couple of the cast iron rods that held panes in, and he's able to slip out this window and up on this little building here, and then hide in the recesses of this building while he waits for Burke to throw the ladder over the nearby wall. But it takes forever for Burke to do that. He encounters a security guard with a dog, and he encounters some young couple who are necking in their car, and he has to chase them away. And Burke finally throws the ladder over, and Blake by this point was convinced the whole thing was off, but he managed to scramble over the ladder, and he breaks his wrist and hits his head jumping down to the other side. But they jump into the car and make their way off to the hideaway flat. And then they have this the problem of what to do with Blake, because he's now the most hunted man in England. This is obviously a huge story that this notorious Cold War spy is free. They undergo numerous close calls of being caught, but not to go into all the details. But finally, the Michael and Ann Randall, who are anti-nuclear activists, who had Michael Randall had served some time with Blake, they put together a camper van that they retrofit with a secret compartment, and they hide Blake in the compartment at Christmas time, 1966. And they have a couple young children with them, and they drive across take the ferry across to France, to Belgium and France, with Blake hiding in the back in the secret compartment, and they make their way to Berlin, where Blake is able to rendezvous with his Soviet contacts and eventually fly to Moscow. And this is a visit that his conspirators helped him get to Berlin. They visited Blake in 1990 when they were Randalls and the Pottles were put on trial for helping Blake. But they were, as a side note, they were acquitted on that charge. So Blake spends the remainder of his years somewhat disillusioned in Soviet communism in Moscow. It doesn't take him too long to realize that communism hasn't worked in the Soviet Union. Although he remains a communist, he feels that the Russians haven't done a good job of it. He spends most of his time at a dacha outside of Moscow, where a lot of KGB folks live. And his value to the KGB continued for years afterwards, because he was able to continue to identify MI6 SIS officers and also talk about the techniques for generations of Stasi officers and KGB officers. So he was a revered figure, and Putin would call him on his birthdays to thank this lion of intelligence for the Russians. And he dies just last year. It was of course his view of all this was that he had done the right thing. His only regrets was having to leave behind his English family. He started a new family while he was in Moscow, and again, a pretty remarkable life when you think of this guy was held in as a prisoner by 4 different regimes. If you count the Nazis, Franco's government, the Brits. Who am I forgetting? There's somebody. The North Koreans. So definitely an interesting life, and in my view, one of the most dangerous and most damaging spies of the Cold War, George Blake. So that wraps up my presentation. I'm happy to take some questions.
Steve, that's a fascinating story. I understand that while you were doing your research, you actually were able to make contact with George Blake. How are you able to do that?
Actually, right where I'm sitting now in this cabin where I work here in Montgomery County, I felt like I had to reach Blake somehow, and I wasn't that optimistic that he would speak with me. And I didn't want to go through official channels, go through Russian intelligence, because that was going to go nowhere. I poked around. I can't tell you where I got it, but I got a phone number for Blake, and I just cold called him one morning. When I knew it would be evening Moscow time. He was at his dacha. It was the number to his dacha where he was living most of the time, and he just got on the phone. And I just introduced myself, explained that I was working on a book about the Berlin Tunnel, and would he could I ask him a few questions, and we had a decent chat, and I was able to get a couple of quick questions in about Peter Lunn and what he had done to protect himself from exposure at the time that he was working both at Section Y in London and later in Berlin, and some of what he understood about what the information that the Americans and the Brits were getting from the tunnel at that time. But it wasn't a very lengthy interview, and I wanted more. So he basically begged off after a few minutes and said, "Well, nice talking to you, but I got to go." So I decided when I was doing research in Europe, in Berlin at the Stasi archives, and also doing interviews with folks, I decided I would go out to Moscow and try the same technique in person. And I had directions to his dacha, which were very vague. Basically involved, take the train to this town and get out the back entrance of the train station. And if you look straight ahead, there'll be kind of a dirt road leading to the right, and follow that across 3 more dirt road intersections, and then you'll see a bunch of trees. It was one of those types of directions, but I gave it a whirl, and I was working with a translator from who worked with the Washington Post in the Moscow Bureau and also the Associated Press, and we were asking folks if they, because we didn't seem to be finding the place. I had a picture of what the dacha looked like with that green building with the gabled roof. So I knew what I was looking for, but we weren't seeing it. People insisted they'd never heard of him. And this one older gentleman who was working in his garden, said, "No, never heard of him." As we started to walk away, he said, "Well, you might want to try that house three gates up to the left there." And, sure enough, that was the right place. And we knocked on the gate. You could see that picture, how high the wall was there. I mean, it basically was surrounded by an 8-foot wall, which most of the dachas there were. They were because a lot of KGB folks lived in that area. It was kind of a private compound. And caretaker answered. We could hear dogs barking. As it turned out, the caretaker was very, very friendly. I think we would have been allowed in, but Blake was sick in his bed at that day, unfortunately. And, he wasn't seeing anyone. His wife was away. I think she was off in Moscow. So when she came back, we called, and she agreed to let me speak to Blake once he was better. But that was a couple of weeks before he was better. And by then I was back in the States. So I had to do another phone interview, but it was very useful because I was able to ask him a number of questions about the tunnel, and he was quite helpful. It was an interesting conversation. He filled in a lot of the holes I had in my understanding of what had happened. And, I got to hear his version of events. He's very, very engaging fellow. I think he was always pretty good at winning people over to his side, which is one of the things that made him such an effective spy.
Well, it really is a fascinating story, both the Berlin Tunnel and George Blake. The book is Betrayal in Berlin by Steve Vogel. I want to thank Steve and the Washington Post for yet again just a wonderful story.
Thanks very much, Jim. I appreciate that.